Hello, my name is Valeria. This is my new original story on my channel. Subscribe and enjoy.
They never noticed. The Curvy night cleaner in the Billionaire's tower until she stopped. A $2 billion betrayal. The cameras were already rolling when Hazel Monroe walked into the largest conference room on the top floor of Cross Tower, holding nothing but a single folder and 7 years of silence. 300 shareholders turned in their seats. Somewhere near the front, Nathaniel Pierce smiled the same practiced smile he always wore, the one that had fooled an entire boardroom for almost a decade. Damian Cross stood near the podium with his jaw tight, watching the woman in the gray uniform walk toward the microphone, as if the next sentence she spoke would either save his company or end it. Her hands did not shake, though every instinct she owned screamed that they should. She could feel the weight of 300 unfamiliar stares settling on her gray blazer, on the careful twist of hair she had pinned back that morning with hands that remembered exactly how steady they needed to be for a presentation like this one, learned a decade earlier in a classroom that felt impossibly far away now. Nobody in that room understood how a night cleaner had ended up standing in front of the cameras that were about to decide the future of one of the largest holding companies in the country. To understand that, we have to go back. Not weeks, years. 7 years earlier, Hazel Monroe graduated at the top of her class with a degree in forensic accounting and a job offer from Sterling and Vance, one of the most respected auditing firms in Manhattan. She was 22, sharp, and certain that numbers never lied, even when the people behind them did. For 2 years, she believed that certainty would protect her. It did not. When Sterling and Vance collapsed overnight, after a hidden network of shell companies was exposed draining client funds for years, the partners needed someone to blame, who was junior enough to sacrifice and visible enough to satisfy the press. Hazel had flagged irregularities months earlier in a routine report. Irregularities that were quietly buried by people far above her position. When the scandal broke, those same people pointed directly at her name on that report and called it proof of involvement rather than proof of a warning ignored. The investigation eventually cleared her of any wrongdoing. The newspapers that printed her photograph on the front page never printed the correction with the same size headline. No firm in the city would touch her resume after that, no matter how many interviews ended with someone saying her qualifications were impressive. 2 years of rejection taught her a lesson sharper than anything she had learned in school. Reputation, once broken in public, rarely heals in private. By the time her son Marcus turned 3, Hazel needed steady income more than she needed a career that matched her degree. A cleaning company offered her a night shift at Cross Tower, one of the tallest buildings on Fifth Avenue, home to Cross Industries, a holding company with interests in real estate, logistics, and private investment funds across 4 continents. The pay was decent. The hours let her be home in the mornings to walk Marcus to school. She told herself it was temporary. 3 years later, it had become simply her life. Her mornings followed a rhythm she had built carefully over 3 years, one small ritual layered on top of another, until the whole structure felt almost steady. She would arrive home a little after 6, when the sky over Queens was just beginning to lighten, peel off her uniform, and lie down for exactly 2 hours before Marcus woke. By 8, she was making him oatmeal with too much cinnamon, listening to him explain, in exhaustive detail, why his dinosaur figures needed separate bowls so the herbivores would not feel threatened at breakfast. By 8:40, She was walking him the 4 blocks to school, past the bakery that always smelled like burnt sugar, past the corner where an elderly man sold newspapers nobody read anymore, out of stubborn loyalty to a habit. By 9, she was asleep again, until it was time to start the whole quiet machinery over. It was not the life she had once imagined for herself, sitting in lecture halls memorizing accounting standards and case law, certain that competence alone would be enough to build a career that mattered. But it was steady, and steady, after the year that followed the Sterling and Vance collapse, had come to feel like its own kind of luxury. She was not entirely alone on the night shift. Rosa Delgado, a woman in her 50s who had worked the Cross-Tower contract for almost a decade, took Hazel under her wing during her first month and never quite let go. Rosa knew which executives left food in the break room refrigerator until it grew its own ecosystem, which ones tipped generously around the holidays, and which ones treated the cleaning staff like furniture that occasionally needed dusting. Nathaniel Pierce fell firmly into the last category. Mr. Pierce notices everything and remembers nothing kindly, Rosa told her once, wiping down the executive kitchen counter with more force than the task strictly required. Stay out of his eye line. A man like that does not forget a face he has decided to dislike. Hazel had laughed quietly at the warning back then, certain it would never apply to her, since being noticed at all required first being seen. Cross Tower occupied 32 floors, and the top 5 belonged entirely to Damien Cross, who had inherited the company from his father at 31 and spent the 7 years since proving to a skeptical board that inheritance was not the same thing as competence. He worked later than anyone else in the building, often past midnight, often alone, surrounded by glass walls that reflected a city he rarely had time to look at. Hazel had cleaned that floor 3 nights a week for almost 3 years, and in all that time, Damien Cross had probably spoken 11 words to her, most of them some version of thank you, said without looking up. She did not mind. Being unseen had its advantages. It meant nobody asked questions about a woman whose curves filled out her uniform in ways the company dress code clearly had not been designed for, and nobody whispered about the gap on her resume, because nobody bothered reading a resume for a cleaning position. She moved through the executive floor each night with a cart and a quiet kind of pride, doing one job well after losing another job through no fault of her own. Her supervisor, a clipped, efficient woman named Donna, had one rule above all others for the executive floor: be invisible. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not linger near open documents. Do not, under any circumstances, draw attention to yourself in front of Mr. Cross or his senior staff. Hazel had followed that rule for 3 years without effort, because invisibility, by then, felt less like a rule and more like a second skin. That winter, the rule was about to become impossible to keep. It began on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of night that blurred into every other night on that floor. Hazel was restocking the supply closet near the executive conference room when she heard raised voices through the glass wall, low enough to be private, sharp enough to carry. Damien Cross stood at the head of the long table, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, staring down a stack of documents like they had personally insulted him. Across from him stood Nathaniel Pierce, Chief Operating Officer of Cross Industries for the past 9 years, a man whose calm exterior had earned him the nickname Ice inside the building, though never to his face. "The board wants this finalized by Friday," Pierce said, his voice smooth as polished marble. Voss has already lined up the financing on his end. We cannot afford to look hesitant in front of an investor of that caliber." "I am not hesitant," Damien said. "I am careful. There is a difference, Nathaniel, and you used to know it." "Careful is a luxury we do not have this quarter," Pierce replied, and something in his tone made Hazel pause behind her cart, listening despite every instinct telling her to keep moving. The name Voss caught in her memory like a splinter she could not quite locate. She knew that name. She could not, in that moment, remember from where. Richard Voss had been a fixture at cross-family gatherings for as long as Damien could remember. The uncle who was not technically an uncle, present at every birthday, every holiday, every quiet family dinner during the difficult final year of his father's illness. It was Voss who had sat beside him in the hospital room the night his father died. Voss who had handed him his father's cufflinks afterward and told him, in a voice rough with genuine grief, that the company would survive because Damien had more of his father in him than he realized. Of everyone on the board, Voss was the one name Damien had never once thought to question, not because he was naive, but because some forms of trust are built so early and so deeply that questioning them feels less like caution and more like betrayal in the opposite direction. Pierce left the conference room a few minutes later, his expression smooth and untroubled, the way it always was. He did not notice Hazel near the supply closet. Nobody on that floor ever noticed Hazel, which was precisely why, when he tucked a folder under his arm and walked briskly toward the elevators without it fully closed, a single loose page slipped free and drifted to the carpet beneath the conference table, unnoticed. He did not come back for it. Hazel waited until the floor was silent again before she entered the conference room to clean it. The page was still there, face up, a spreadsheet dense with numbers and abbreviations that would have meant nothing to almost anyone who worked in that building. It meant everything to her. Old instincts do not disappear simply because a person stops using them for a living. Hazel recognized the structure within seconds, the same pattern she had flagged 7 years earlier at Sterling and Vance, before her career was quietly destroyed for noticing it. A series of transfers disguised as consulting fees, each one small enough to avoid scrutiny on its own, all of them routed through a chain of shell entities that, when added together over 12 months, amounted to a sum large enough to gut a company from the inside. She sat down slowly in one of the leather chairs she was supposed to be cleaning, the page trembling slightly in her hands, and read it 3 more times to be certain she was not imagining patterns that were not there. She was not imagining anything. The final entity in the chain, a holding company registered only weeks earlier in the Cayman Islands, carried a name that made her stomach turn. Voss Capital Partners. She remembered now. Richard Voss was not a stranger to her. 7 years earlier, his name had appeared briefly in the background of the Sterling and Vance investigation, a quiet investor connected to several of the shell companies that drained the firm dry, a name that vanished from the headlines before the press ever connected the dots, while Hazel's photograph stayed printed for weeks. If you are starting to feel the pull of this story, the way we did when we first found it, this might be the perfect moment to hit that subscribe button, because what Hazel discovers in the next few minutes changes everything that follows, and you will not want to miss a single piece of what happens next. For a long moment, Hazel considered the easiest path available to her. Shred the page, finish the floor, walk away the way she had walked away from finance entirely, and protect the fragile stability she had spent 3 years rebuilding for herself and her son. She had already lost one career to a man's hidden scheme. She understood, better than almost anyone in that tower, exactly what it cost to speak up against people with more power than truth on their side. But she also remembered something else from those years at Sterling and Vance, a small detail that had stayed lodged in her chest long after the rest of the scandal faded from memory. She had warned them. She had filed the report. She had done everything right, and it had not mattered, because nobody with authority had been willing to listen to a junior analyst pointing at numbers that powerful people preferred to ignore. This time, she folded the page carefully into quarters and slid it into the inner pocket of her uniform instead of the shredder. She told herself it was only for safekeeping until she decided what to do. That night, after Marcus was finally asleep with his favorite stuffed triceratops tucked under one arm, Hazel sat at the kitchen table with her old laptop, the one with a cracked corner and a fan that wheezed like an old man climbing stairs, and began searching for any public trace of Voss Capital Partners. Most of what she found was carefully unremarkable. A handful of press releases about minor real estate investments, a charity gala photograph from 3 years earlier showing Richard Voss shaking hands with a city councilman. Nothing that explained the cold recognition that had settled in her stomach the moment she read the name. She found the connection almost by accident, buried in an archived business journal article from 8 years earlier, discussing minor investors in a since-dissolved consulting firm called Taro Logistics Solutions. Taro had been one of the shell companies named, briefly, and without much detail, in the original Sterling and Vance investigation, before the case quietly narrowed its focus to junior staff and conveniently stopped asking who had funded the company in the first place. Richard Voss was listed as a minority investor in Taro's founding documents, a detail apparently too small for anyone at the time to chase any further. Hazel stared at the screen for a long time after that, the apartment silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the building settling around her. 7 years of unanswered questions suddenly had the outline of an answer, and the answer was sitting on the board of the very company she now quietly cleaned each night. She closed the laptop before the feeling in her chest could fully resolve itself into either anger or fear, and sat in the dark kitchen a while longer instead, trying to decide which one she was actually allowed to feel. Over the following 2 weeks, Hazel began arriving slightly earlier for her shifts and leaving slightly later, using the extra minutes to study patterns in documents left carelessly on desks and conference tables throughout the executive floor, the same way she once studied client files at Sterling and Vance. She kept careful notes in a small notebook she hid inside her cleaning cart, beneath a false bottom of folded towels. One night, nearly 2 weeks into her quiet research, she came within a single closed door of being discovered. She had let herself into an empty conference room to photograph a stack of vendor renewal contracts, left out from an afternoon meeting, working quickly under the glow of her phone screen rather than risk turning on the overhead lights. She heard the elevator chime down the hall and barely had time to slide the contracts back into their folder and duck behind the catering cart before Pierce himself walked past the glass wall, phone pressed to his ear, deep in a conversation she could not quite make out beyond fragments. Renewal terms. Voss. Before the board notices the pattern. She stayed frozen behind the cart for almost 4 full minutes after his footsteps faded, her heart pounding loudly enough that she was half convinced he would hear it through the glass. It was the first time the danger of what she was doing stopped feeling theoretical and started feeling like something that could genuinely cost her everything if she made one careless mistake. She did not stop. She simply became more careful, timing her research for the narrow windows when she knew, from 3 years of memorizing the floor's rhythms, that Pierce reliably left the building. What she found over those 2 weeks confirmed her worst suspicion. The scheme was not a single transaction. It was a slow, patient draining of Cross Industries through a contract renewal cycle Pierce had quietly restructured over the previous 18 months, each renewal slightly more generous to outside vendors than the last, each vendor tracing back through layers designed to discourage exactly the kind of attention Hazel was now giving them, to Voss Capital Partners. Richard Voss, she learned through careful late-night research on the small laptop she kept for Marcus's homework, was no stranger to the Cross family either. Public records described him as a longtime friend of Damien's late father, a trusted family advisor who had sat on the Cross Industries board for over a decade, the kind of man Damien likely trusted without question, because trusting him had probably been instilled since childhood. That was what made the scheme so dangerous. It was not an outside attack. It was a betrayal, wearing the face of an old friend. Hazel found herself watching Damien Cross differently after that. Not as the distant, unreachable man at the head of a glass tower, but as someone walking directly into a trap, set by people he had no reason to suspect, the same way she once walked into a trap at Sterling and Vance, set by people she trusted to protect her. The first real conversation between them happened almost by accident, on a night neither of them expected. It was nearly 1 a.m, 3 weeks after Hazel found the page beneath the conference table, when she pushed her cart past Damien's office and found the door open, the lights low, and the man himself sitting on the floor with his back against the window, tie completely undone, a half-empty glass of something amber beside him. She should have kept walking. Donna's rule echoed in her mind, clear and absolute. Instead, something in his expression, the particular exhaustion of a man carrying a weight he could not name, stopped her at the doorway. "Mr. Cross," she said quietly. "Are you all right?" He looked up, surprised, as though her voice belonged to someone he had forgotten could speak. For a moment he seemed about to send her away, with the same polite indifference he showed every night. Instead, something in him simply gave out. "My father built this company from nothing," he said, staring at the city lights instead of at her. 41 floors of glass and steel, and I am terrified I am going to lose half of it to a deal I do not fully understand, signed by people I am supposed to trust completely. Hazel hesitated only a moment before stepping fully into the room. "Sometimes the people closest to us are the hardest to question," she said. "Not because we trust their character, because questioning them feels like questioning everything we built our whole life around." He looked at her properly then, perhaps for the first time in 3 years, as if noticing all at once that the woman who emptied his trash and vacuumed his carpet had just said something that cut closer to the truth than anything his own advisors had told him in months. "That sounds like the voice of experience," he said. "It is," she said simply, and left it there, because the rest of that sentence was not hers to give away yet. She made him a cup of coffee from the small kitchen down the hall before she left that night, set it quietly on his desk, and said nothing more. It was a small gesture. It was also the first time in 3 years that Damien Cross actually remembered her name the next morning. Over the following 2 weeks, those late-night encounters became less accidental and more frequent, though neither of them said so directly. Hazel began timing her work on his floor for the hours she knew he was most likely to still be there. Damien began finding small reasons to remain in his office a little later than necessary, and neither of them examined too closely why. They talked about small things first. His father, who had taught him that a handshake meant more than a contract, a lesson the modern business world seemed determined to disprove. Marcus, who had just started losing his first tooth and treated the event with the gravity of a presidential announcement. The particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who need something from you, compared to the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who do not see you at all. One night in early December, a delivery driver mistakenly left an order of noodles meant for a different floor entirely outside Damien's office door. Rather than send it back down, he simply opened both containers, found 2 mismatched forks in his desk drawer, and asked Hazel, almost shyly, if she had eaten dinner yet that night. She had not. Most nights she ate a sandwich in her car, between her day job applications and her shift, a habit Marcus had started calling her invisible dinner because he never actually saw her eat it. Sitting on the floor of a billionaire's office at midnight, sharing dinner out of paper containers with the man whose trash she usually collected, felt absurd enough that she nearly laughed out loud. "You do this often?" she asked. "Eat dinner on the floor with members of your cleaning staff?" "Never once," he admitted, "though I am beginning to understand why I should have." They talked for almost an hour longer that night than either of them intended. He told her about learning to sail with his father on Long Island Sound as a boy, before his father got too sick to leave the city for more than a weekend at a time. She told him about the particular silence of an empty courtroom the day the Sterling and Vance investigation officially closed, without ever calling her name to clear it publicly. How she had sat in the back row anyway, needing to hear the words, even if no reporter bothered writing them down. Neither of them mentioned the folded page Hazel still carried, hidden beneath the false bottom of her cart, growing heavier with every night she failed to bring it forward. She might have continued carrying that weight in silence indefinitely, except that Nathaniel Pierce noticed something he did not like. It started with small things. A folder slightly out of place from where he remembered leaving it. A printout missing from a stack he was certain had been complete. A feeling, sharpened by 9 years of careful, deliberate dishonesty, that someone on that floor was paying closer attention than a cleaning contract required. He began watching Hazel, the way a predator watches movement at the edge of its vision, uncertain yet, but unwilling to dismiss the instinct entirely. The confrontation came on a Thursday evening, earlier than her usual shift, when Pierce found her alone in the executive break room and closed the door behind him with deliberate quiet. "You have been spending a lot of time on this floor lately," he said, his voice maintaining its usual polish, even as his eyes studied her without warmth. "Longer hours, earlier arrivals. Donna mentioned it to me herself, thinking I would find it impressive dedication." "I take my job seriously, Mr. Pierce," Hazel said, keeping her voice level despite the sudden tightness in her chest. "I am sure you do," he said. "Tell me, Miss Monroe, in your previous line of work, before this one, did diligence always serve you so well?" The question landed like a blow, precise and deliberate. He knew. Somehow, in 9 years of careful manipulation, Nathaniel Pierce had learned exactly who she used to be, and exactly what that history could be used to destroy a second time. "I do not know what you mean," she said, though her voice betrayed her with the slightest tremor. "I think you do," he said, stepping closer, his smile never wavering even as his words turned to ice beneath it. "A woman, with your particular history, understands better than most how quickly a quiet accusation can ruin a life that looks stable from the outside. A single phone call to the right reporter, reminding the city of the cleaner who used to work in finance, before a scandal she conveniently survived while others did not. How do you imagine that story would read, especially with a young son depending on your paycheck?" Hazel's hands curled at her sides, every instinct telling her to step back, to apologize, to disappear the way she had trained herself to disappear for the past 3 years. Instead, something steadier rose up beneath the fear, the same quiet resolve that had once made her flag, a report nobody wanted flagged. "Is that a threat, Mr. Pierce?" she asked. "It is a reminder," he said softly, "that some people are better off remaining exactly as invisible as everyone assumes they are." He left without waiting for a response, his footsteps unhurried down the hallway, perfectly confident that fear alone would handle the rest of the problem for him. He did not stop at threats. 2 days later, Hazel arrived for her shift to find Donna waiting for her by the service elevator, arms crossed, expression unusually grim. "Security flagged your badge, accessing the records room on the 30th floor at 2 a.m. last Thursday," Donna said. "That is restricted access for cleaning staff. Mr. Pierce's office filed a formal complaint this morning, suggesting it might be worth reviewing whether you should keep this contract at all." Hazel's mouth went dry. She had never gone anywhere near the records room, restricted or otherwise. But she understood immediately what had happened. A man with 9 years of practice manipulating financial records would have no difficulty manufacturing an access log that did not exist, not when it meant removing a witness before she became inconvenient in a more permanent way. "I was never on the 30th floor that night," she said. "I can prove it. I clocked out from the 28th floor break room at 1:40, and the cameras in that hallway would show exactly where I was the entire shift." Donna's expression softened slightly, though the wariness did not entirely leave her eyes. "I believe you, Hazel. I have known you 3 years, and you have never once given me reason to doubt your honesty. But Mr. Pierce is not someone the company likes to contradict without very solid proof. And right now, all I have is your word against a printed log with your badge number on it." Rosa found her 20 minutes later, sitting on an overturned bucket in the supply closet with her face in her hands, and did not ask questions before pulling up a second bucket and sitting beside her in silence for a long moment. "Whatever this is," Rosa finally said, "I have known you 3 years, and I have never once seen you cut a corner or tell a lie that mattered. If Pierce is coming after you with manufactured paperwork, it means you are close enough to something real, that he is scared of you. Scared men make careless mistakes, Hazel. You just have to outlast the fear long enough to watch him make one." It was not legal advice. It was not even particularly sophisticated advice. But sitting in that small, cluttered closet at 2 a.m, it was exactly steady enough to carry Hazel through the rest of that night. That night, lying awake long after her shift ended, Hazel finally understood the full shape of what she was facing. This was not simply a wealthy man protecting a secret. This was a careful, practiced campaign to discredit her before she could speak, built by someone who had clearly done this kind of thing before and knew exactly how thin the line was between a respected employee and an unemployable cautionary tale. She thought, too, about Marcus, asleep 2 rooms away, with his triceratops still tucked under one arm, utterly unaware that his mother's entire fragile stability balanced on a single folded page hidden beneath a layer of towels. He had asked her once, not long after they moved into the small apartment in Queens, why she always smelled like lemon cleaner when she kissed him goodnight. She had told him it meant she had been working hard to keep their home, and he had accepted that answer, the way small children accept most things, with simple, uncomplicated trust. She was not ready to explain to a 6-year-old what it might mean if that trust turned out to be misplaced, because his mother chose silence over truth a second time. It very nearly did. That night, Hazel sat in her car in the parking garage for almost 20 minutes before she found the strength to drive home, replaying every possible consequence of staying silent against every possible consequence of speaking out. Marcus needed stability more than he needed a mother chasing justice that had already cost her everything once before. The rational decision, the safe decision, was obvious. But sitting there in the dark, she kept returning to one image: Damien Cross on the floor of his office, exhausted and unknowingly walking toward a betrayal designed by a man his father had trusted completely. She thought about the version of herself 7 years ago, hoping desperately that someone with more power than her would notice the warning she had already given and act on it before it was too late. Nobody had. This time, she had the chance to be that person for someone else. She drove home, kissed her sleeping son on the forehead, and sat awake at her kitchen table until dawn, organizing 3 weeks of careful notes into a clear and undeniable timeline. The deal Pierce had warned about, the one tied to Voss Capital Partners, was scheduled for final signing in 5 days, during a shareholder presentation that would also serve as the public unveiling of a major new investment partnership. 5 days to decide whether invisibility was truly safer than the alternative. 3 days before the signing, Hazel made her decision. She arrived at Cross Tower an hour before her shift, dressed not in her cleaning uniform, but in the only blazer she still owned from her old career, the one she had kept folded in the back of her closet for 3 years, without quite admitting to herself why. The security guard at the front desk, accustomed to seeing her in a different uniform entirely, hesitated before waving her through, clearly uncertain what to make of the change. The receptionist outside Damien's office attempted to stop her with practiced politeness, explaining that Mr. Cross was unavailable without a scheduled appointment. Hazel did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Tell him it concerns the Voss Capital deal," she said. "Tell him the cleaner from the night shift needs 5 minutes, and that after he hears what I have to say, he will wish he had given me 10. Something in her tone, steady and entirely without apology, made the receptionist pause and pick up the phone after all. Damien came out himself a minute later, visibly confused to see Hazel standing in his reception area in daylight, dressed like someone who belonged in a boardroom rather than behind a cleaning cart. Whatever question formed on his face disappeared the moment she held out the folded page. "This fell out of Nathaniel Pierce's folder 3 weeks ago," she said quietly. I should have brought it to you the same night. I did not, because the last time I tried to stop a scheme exactly like this one, it cost me my entire career, and I was afraid of losing everything a second time. I am done being afraid." Damien unfolded the page slowly, his eyes moving across the columns of numbers, with the particular stillness of a man recognizing something he desperately did not want to see. "Where did you learn to read a spreadsheet like this?" he asked, though his voice had lost its earlier confusion, replaced by something far more careful. "7 years ago, I was a forensic accountant at Sterling and Vance," Hazel said. "I flagged a similar pattern before the firm collapsed. Nobody listened. The people responsible blamed me instead, and the financial backer connected to those shell companies disappeared from the headlines before anyone thought to ask harder questions. His name was Richard Voss." Damien went very still. "Richard has known my family since before I was born," he said slowly. "He sat at my father's funeral in the front row. He has been on this board for 11 years. "I know," Hazel said. "That is exactly why nobody on your team thought to question the company carrying his name at the end of that transfer chain. The people closest to us are always the hardest to suspect, Mr. Cross. That is not a flaw in your judgment. That is how every successful betrayal works. If the people in this story feel real to you right now, if you find yourself wanting to know exactly how Hazel and Damien expose a man who is hidden behind trust for over a decade, this is exactly the moment to subscribe, because the next part of this story moves fast, and we do not want you to miss the confrontation everyone has been waiting for." For the next 2 days, Damien and Hazel worked together in a kind of careful, quiet alliance that neither of them spoke about openly in front of the rest of the staff. He gave her temporary access to financial systems she had not touched in 7 years, watching with something close to wonder as she moved through them with the same precision she once brought to Sterling and Vance, faster and more thorough than the external auditors his company had paid handsomely the previous year. Late at night, after the rest of the floor had emptied, they sat together over printouts and spreadsheets, building a case neither Pierce nor Voss could explain away. Somewhere during those 2 long nights, the careful distance between a billionaire and a night cleaner began quietly dissolving into something neither of them had words for yet. Something built less on attraction and more on the rare experience of being truly seen by someone else for exactly who they were, history and all. "You could have stayed quiet," Damien said on the second night, watching her highlight a transfer dated only weeks earlier. "Nobody would have known you found that page." "I would have known," Hazel said. "I spent 7 years regretting that I was not louder the first time. I was not going to make that mistake twice, even if it cost me everything again." "It will not cost you everything," Damien said quietly. "Not this time." She did not answer, because she had learned, the hard way, not to trust promises made before a fight was finished. But something in his voice, steady and certain in a way Pierce's had never been, made her want to believe him anyway. On their final night of preparation, 2 nights before the scheduled signing, Damien found something in the archives that even Hazel had not expected. Buried in records from 9 years earlier, shortly after Pierce had first joined the company as a junior operations manager, was a nearly identical contract restructuring attempt that had been quietly abandoned within months, never fully executed, the paper trail ending abruptly the same month Pierce received an unusually large promotion that skipped 2 levels of seniority entirely. This was not his first attempt, Damien said quietly, staring at the old documents. He tried something like this 9 years ago, and someone caught it early enough to shut it down. They just never told the board the real reason for the sudden promotion afterward. Or someone caught it, Hazel said slowly, the pieces settling into place, and decided it was more useful to control him quietly than expose him publicly. They looked at each other across the desk, both arriving at the same uncomfortable conclusion at the same moment. Whoever had discovered Pierce's first attempt 9 years earlier had chosen silence over accountability, and the only person on that board with the access and the motive to make that particular trade was the same man who now stood to gain the most from finishing what Pierce had started almost a decade later. On the morning of the presentation, Hazel arrived at Cross Tower 2 hours early, the folder containing 18 months of evidence tucked carefully into a borrowed leather portfolio Damien had given her the night before, insisting she would need something that looked the part, even if the contents mattered infinitely more than the case they traveled in. She found him in his office, already dressed, staring out at the city, with the same stillness she remembered from the night they first truly spoke. "Second thoughts?" she asked from the doorway. "None about the evidence," he said. "Several about asking the woman who cleans my floor at midnight to stand in front of 300 shareholders and accuse a man my father trusted with his life. If this goes wrong, it does not just cost me the company, Hazel. It costs you everything a second time, and I am not certain I have the right to ask that of you." "You are not asking," she said quietly. "I already decided, the night I kept that folded page instead of feeding it to the shredder. This was never only about saving Cross Industries for me. It was about finally finishing the sentence I started 7 years ago and was never allowed to complete." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, the particular nod of a man who finally understood that some decisions are not his to make for someone else, no matter how much he wished he could carry the risk himself. The shareholder presentation took place exactly as scheduled, in the largest conference room on the top floor, broadcast live to investors who could not attend in person, recorded by at least 2 financial news outlets who considered the Voss Capital Partnership significant enough to cover. Richard Voss himself sat in the front row beside Pierce, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, radiating the particular calm of a man who believed his greatest risk had already passed unnoticed. He was wrong. Damien opened the presentation as scheduled, thanking the board and the shareholders for their continued confidence in Cross Industries, his voice giving away nothing of what was about to happen. Pierce, seated near the front, allowed himself the smallest, most private smile, certain the deal he had spent 18 months constructing was about to be finalized exactly as planned. Then, Damien invited Hazel Monroe to the podium. A ripple of confusion moved through the room as a woman in a simple gray blazer walked to the front, carrying a single folder. Pierce's smile faltered for the first time in 9 years. Voss leaned forward slightly, his expression sharpening into something far less relaxed. "My name is Hazel Monroe," she said, her voice steady, despite 300 unfamiliar faces watching her closely. "For the past 3 years, I have worked the night shift cleaning this very floor. Before that, I spent 2 years as a forensic accountant at Sterling and Vance, until I flagged a pattern of fraudulent shell transactions that nobody with authority wanted exposed, and was blamed for the very scandal I tried to prevent. She opened the folder. 18 months ago, a nearly identical pattern began appearing in cross-industries vendor contracts, restructured gradually enough to avoid routine scrutiny, routed through a chain of shell entities that ultimately leads to Voss Capital Partners. The room erupted into murmurs. Pierce rose halfway from his seat, his composure finally cracking. "This is absurd," he said sharply. "A cleaning employee has no authority to address financial allegations of this magnitude, and frankly, no qualification to understand them." "She has every qualification," Damien said calmly from beside the podium. "Since I personally verified every figure in that folder against our internal systems over the past 3 days, with the help of 2 independent auditors who confirmed her findings this morning." Voss finally spoke, his voice carrying the same practiced warmth he had used at family dinners for over a decade. "Damien, I understand emotions are running high, given recent stress on the company, but surely you do not believe the word of a member of the cleaning staff over the judgment of people who have stood beside you and your father for years." "I believed the evidence, Richard," Damien said, and for the first time that morning, real coldness entered his voice. "And the evidence traces 7 years of pattern, from Sterling and Vance to this boardroom, directly back to companies registered under your name." What followed was not a single dramatic confession, but something slower and ultimately more damning. Hazel walked the room through 18 months of carefully restructured contracts, each connection logical, each document undeniable, while 2 independent forensic auditors Damien had quietly brought in over the previous 3 days confirmed every figure in real time for the assembled shareholders and reporters. Eleanor Whitcomb, the company's longest-serving board chair, and a woman known throughout the industry for her relentless skepticism toward anything resembling drama in a shareholder meeting, interrupted the presentation only once, her voice cutting cleanly through the murmuring room. "Miss Monroe," she said, "you are asking 300 shareholders to accept the financial judgment of someone whose listed occupation, as of yesterday, was janitorial services. Convince me why I should trust your reading of these numbers over the auditors this company has paid for years." "You should not trust me because of my job title, Mrs. Whitcomb," Hazel answered, holding her gaze steady. "You should trust the numbers, because every figure on every page in front of you can be independently verified against your own internal systems within the hour, and because the only reason nobody verified them sooner is that nobody expected someone in my position to be paying close enough attention to find them." Whitcomb studied her for a long moment, then turned to the 2 independent auditors, seated near the front. "Confirm it," she said simply, and the room fell into a heavier kind of silence while the verification began. Pierce attempted twice to interrupt with accusations of fabrication, each attempt weaker than the last, as the timeline grew increasingly impossible to dismiss. On his second attempt, something in his composure finally cracked entirely. "You have no idea what it is like," he said, his voice rising for the first time in 9 years of careful, measured control, "to build this company beside Damien's father for 2 decades, to be told every single year that you are next in line, and then to watch a 31-year-old inherit everything simply because of whose name appeared on his birth certificate. I built half of what this company became. I was owed considerably more than a vice president's salary and a quiet office on the 31st floor. It was not a justification anyone in that room found persuasive, least of all Hazel, who understood better than most how easily resentment could be mistaken for entitlement when a person spent long enough nursing it in private. But it explained, finally, the missing piece neither she nor Damien had fully understood until that moment. Pierce had not done this purely for money. He had done it because somewhere along the way, loyalty curdled into bitterness, and bitterness, given enough time and enough access, found Richard Voss waiting patiently to make use of it. Voss said very little after his initial protest, his expression settling into the particular stillness of a man calculating exits that no longer existed. There was one more name left to surface before the morning ended. Pressed by a question from a sharp-eyed reporter about how such an extensive scheme had passed 2 consecutive annual audits without detection, Damien revealed the final piece Hazel had uncovered only the previous evening, almost too late to include in the presentation at all. Cross Industries' long-time external auditor, a quiet, unremarkable man named Gerald Finch, who had signed off on the company's books for 6 straight years, had been receiving a separate, undisclosed consulting fee from a Voss-controlled entity for exactly as long as the fraudulent contracts had existed. Finch, seated near the back of the room, expecting nothing more than another routine quarterly presentation, went pale as every camera in the room turned toward him. He did not deny it. He simply gathered his briefcase, said nothing, and walked out under the same quiet security escort that would soon collect both Pierce and Voss. It was, Hazel would later admit to Damien, the detail she had been most afraid she would not manage to prove in time. A scheme this large rarely survives on the strength of 2 men alone. It survives because someone whose entire job is to catch exactly this kind of fraud chooses, for the right price, not to look too closely. By the time security quietly escorted both men from the building 2 hours later, at the request of the board, and under the watchful eye of financial regulators, who had been alerted that same morning, the story had already begun spreading through every major financial outlet in the city. Within the hour, Cross Industries stock, which had dipped sharply the moment news broke mid-presentation, began recovering as analysts updated their assessments to reflect a company that had not merely survived an attempted betrayal, but had uncovered and dismantled it from within, using internal diligence rather than waiting for regulators to do the work for them. By closing bell, shares had climbed higher than they stood the previous week, a detail several reporters noted with evident surprise in their afternoon coverage, framing the entire episode less as a scandal and more as proof of a company finally functioning the way it was always supposed to. Not as a story about fraud, though it was certainly that. As a story about a forensic accountant who had been silenced once, who refused to be silenced twice, and whose quiet persistence had saved one of the largest companies in the country from collapsing under a betrayal hidden inside its own boardroom for over a decade. The weeks that followed moved faster than Hazel had time to fully process. Sterling and Vance, long since dissolved, issued a public statement acknowledging that her original report had been accurate and unfairly dismissed 7 years earlier, a correction that arrived far too late to matter to her career, yet meant more than she expected when she finally read it. Cross Industries offered her something that mattered considerably more than an apology, a senior position overseeing internal financial compliance, with a salary that finally matched the degree she had earned a decade earlier, and an office on the very floor she had spent 3 years cleaning in silence. On her first morning in the new role, Hazel found a single item waiting on her desk, wrapped in plain brown paper with no card attached. Inside was a small framed photograph of the cross tower skyline at night, the same view she had spent 3 years seeing only through someone else's window while emptying someone else's trash. She did not need a card to know who had left it there, and she hung it on the wall, directly across from her new desk, where she would see it every single morning afterward, not as a reminder of where she had been, but as proof of how far attention to detail and quiet persistence could ultimately carry a person willing to keep paying it. She almost said no, out of habit more than hesitation, until Damien found her on her last scheduled night shift, standing in the same supply closet where this entire story had quietly begun. "You do not have to take the position because of anything between us," he said carefully. "I want that understood first. You earned this with or without whatever this is that has been happening between us these past few weeks." Hazel allowed herself, for the first time in years, a genuine smile. "And what exactly is happening between us, Mr. Cross?" she asked. "I am hoping," he said, "that it is the beginning of something neither of us has to hide in a supply closet to talk about anymore. If this story made you believe, even for a moment, that the person nobody notices might be the very person holding everything together, then you already understand exactly why we make these videos, and exactly why subscribing means you will never miss the next one." 6 months later, Hazel Monroe walked into Cross Tower each morning, through the front entrance instead of the loading dock, wearing a blazer instead of a uniform, carrying a leather portfolio instead of a cleaning cart. Marcus liked to tell his classmates that his mother caught the bad guys at his new school, a description that was not entirely inaccurate. Richard Voss faced multiple charges of securities fraud and conspiracy, his decades of carefully built reputation collapsing within weeks under the same kind of evidence he had once assumed no one would ever find. Nathaniel Pierce, facing his own charges, eventually cooperated with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence, confirming every detail Hazel had documented during those quiet weeks she spent gathering proof nobody asked her to gather. Damien Cross rebuilt his board with people he trusted for reasons beyond inherited loyalty, and made it a quiet but firm policy that every employee at Cross Industries, regardless of position, would have a direct channel to report concerns without fear of retaliation, a policy he often said existed because of one cleaner who refused to stay invisible when it mattered most. The Securities and Exchange Commission opened a formal investigation within a month of the presentation, drawing heavily on the documentation Hazel had assembled during those careful, frightened weeks of midnight research. Richard Voss eventually accepted a plea agreement rather than risk trial, a decision that spared him decades behind bars, but ended, permanently and publicly, the version of his reputation that had protected him for over 30 years. Gerald Finch lost his license to practice as a certified public accountant entirely, the quiet, unremarkable ending of a career built on looking away at exactly the right moments for exactly the right price. Rosa Delgado, who had spent a decade walking past executives who never learned her name, found herself promoted to floor supervisor for the entire cleaning contract within the year, a change Hazel insisted on personally the moment she had any influence over staffing decisions at all. Donna kept her position as well, though she liked to tell anyone who would listen that she had always suspected there was more to Hazel Monroe than a uniform 2 sizes too boxy for her shoulders. Marcus, for his part, remained entirely unimpressed by his mother's promotion until the day Damien Cross showed up at his school's career day and spent 20 minutes explaining, with complete sincerity, that the most important lesson he had learned in business was to always listen carefully to the person everyone else assumes has nothing important to say. After that, Marcus told every classmate within earshot that his mother's boyfriend was basically a superhero who wore very boring suits instead of a cape. As for the two of them, what began in a supply closet and a late-night office floor eventually became something neither of them bothered hiding anymore, not because the world suddenly stopped noticing the difference between a billionaire and a night cleaner, but because both of them had finally stopped caring whether it did. Late one evening, almost a year to the day after she found a single folded page beneath a conference table, Hazel stood at the window of her new office, watching the same city lights she used to see, only through the reflection on someone else's glass, while pushing a cleaning cart down an empty hallway. Marcus's photograph sat on her desk, beside the framed skyline Damien had left her months earlier, and somewhere 2 floors up, she knew exactly where to find him if she wanted to share the view instead of watching it alone. Hazel Monroe spent 7 years believing that being overlooked meant being powerless. It took one folded page, one quiet decision, and one impossible act of courage to prove that the person nobody bothers to notice is often the only one paying close enough attention to save everything that matters. If you stayed with this story until the very end, you already know it was worth it. And the only thing left to do now is hit subscribe, because the next story waiting for you might just be even harder to forget than this one.